Now we're moving on to the respiratory system, which is how our bodies exchange gases with the atmosphere. Next unit, we'll talk about cellular respiration, which you may remember from lab requires oxygen. This is why we need a constant supply of oxygen to keep our bodies running. In this lecture, we'll talk about differences in respiratory systems across the animal kingdom, and then focus in on the human respiratory system. The main function of the respiratory system is to bring in oxygen and expel carbon dioxide. Again, we need that oxygen for cellular respiration, and carbon dioxide is produced as a byproduct of cellular respiration. Different animals have different types of respiratory systems. Some of them are much simpler than our own. Some small animals, and also single-celled organisms, rely on direct diffusion to get oxygen and expel carbon dioxide. They don't have a complex respiratory system like us. Instead, gases diffuse into and out of the body directly through the body wall. But diffusion is a slow and inefficient process. So again, this can only work in a small organism where most of the cells are fairly close to the external environment. Some other animals have structures called air sacs that increase the surface area for that diffusion to occur. Sea stars are an example. They're still relying on diffusion to get their oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. But they have extensions of their body wall called air sacs that increase that surface area exposed to the air or water that they're in. So this makes the diffusion process a little more efficient. Many aquatic organisms use gills to pull gases from the water and release carbon dioxide. Gills are structures with a high surface area over which this gas exchange can occur. We see gills in fish, but also in many aquatic invertebrates. Gills need to be highly efficient because water only has 5% the oxygen that we have in air. In fish, water enters the mouth, passes over the gills, and then leaves through the gill flaps. So it's moving in one direction as it passes over the gills, exchanging gases. Again, surface area is really important here. So gills tend to have high surface area to maximize that gas exchange. To increase surface area, the gills are composed of many thin filaments called lamellae. Each lamella is packed with capillaries to allow efficient diffusion of gases between the circulatory system and the water. But again, there is low oxygen in the water. So animals with gills often have what we call countercurrent flow, where their blood flows in the opposite direction of the movement of water. Let's look at how this works. First, let's look at what happens in concurrent flow, where blood and water are moving in the same direction. Again, as water passes by the capillaries in the gills, oxygen diffuses into the circulatory system. Because this relies on diffusion, oxygen will only move into the circulatory system if the capillary has lower oxygen concentration than the water. So when oxygenated water first meets the capillary, filled with deoxygenated blood, oxygen rapidly starts to diffuse into the capillary. But as that diffusion occurs and the blood and the water are moving along beside each other, we eventually reach a point where the concentrations are equal between the water and the capillary. So at this point, diffusion stops. You can see that we've only extracted half of the available oxygen from that water. So to make this process more efficient, in most gilled animals, the blood flows in the opposite direction as the water. This way, the most oxygenated blood is in contact with the most oxygenated water, so diffusion will occur across the whole area. As the water loses oxygen, it comes in contact with deoxygenated blood. So we have diffusion happening all along this pathway. This way, the animal can extract all or most of the oxygen in that water as it passes over the gills. There's another type of respiratory system called a tracheal system that we see in insects. Insects don't breathe through their mouths like we do. Instead, they have openings on the sides of their bodies called spiracles. Oxygen enters those spiracles and passes into a network of branching tubes called trachea that deliver the oxygen directly to tissues. Again, this system is still relying primarily on gases diffusing through the trachea, so it's not very efficient. This is why insects can't get very large. And finally, we have the respiratory system you're probably most familiar with because it's how we breathe, lungs. Most terrestrial vertebrates have lungs, which are structures with a large, moist surface area over which gas exchange can occur. Oxygen enters the lungs and diffuses into the circulatory system to be delivered around the body, and carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood into the lungs to be exhaled.